This is lesson 2.6. Use arc, QuadCurve, and CubicCurve. Let's begin with the arc shape. An arc shape defines a partial section of an ellipse. Arcs have two center points and two radius values, and there are options for closing arcs after drawing them. Here are the properties for an arc shape. Center x and center y that define the center point xy coordinates of the arc. Radius x is the width of the arc and radius y is the arc's height. Both values apply to a full ellipse for which the arc is a partial section. Start angle is the starting angle for the arc in degrees. Length, the angular extent of the arc in degrees, and type for the arc's closure specification. Now the values for this closure type let you leave the arc shape open or close the arc by connecting the ends of the arc together as a chord or to the center point with round. Let's show you how to draw arc shapes in a JavaFX program now. This is the arc shapes program, which creates arcs and sets their properties. Let's run this program and see what it displays. What you see are three colored arcs showing up on a light green background. The first arc has a round closure, the second arc a chord closure, and the third arc remains open. Let's look at the code now to see how these arcs were drawn. All three arcs are created with a createArc method. The first argument is the arc's closure type, and the second argument is the arc's x-coordinate. And these are the enums that you use to specify the closure type that you want. This statement adds the three arcs to the root scene graph. Now, let's look at the createArc method that creates each arc. First, we call the default constructor to create the arc shape. This group of setter methods defines the arc's center point, width, and height. The start angle is 45 degrees and the arc length is 270 degrees. Each arc has a coral fill color with a blue stroke. And here's the call to setType, which sets the closure type of the arc. Now, let's change the start angle for each arc from 45 degrees to 135. When you recompile and run this program, you see that all the arcs have been rotated by 90 degrees. Now let's show you how to draw curves in JavaFX. A QuadCurve shape is a quadratic Bezier parametric curve segment with starting and ending points and a single control point. Here are the properties. Start x and start y, which define the xy coordinates of the start point of the QuadCurve segment. End x and end y, which are the ending xy coordinates. And control x and control y that define the xy coordinates of the control point of the QuadCurve segment. Now before we show you the code that draws a QuadCurve, let's take a quick look at a diagram that explains how these properties define the curve segment. Suppose you want to draw this curve. First, specify the start x and start y coordinates that you want. Next, the end x and end y coordinates. And then the control point coordinates, which affects how much curvature you want in the QuadCurve segment. Note that this diagram is only an approximation of how these points interact, but you get the general idea. In JavaFX, you can also draw cubic curves. A cubic curve is a cubic Bezier parametric curve segment. This curve segment has a starting point, ending point, and two control points. Here are the properties. Start x and start y, which define the xy coordinates of the start point of the cubic curve segment. End x and end y, which are the ending xy coordinates. Control x1 and control y1 that define the xy coordinates of the first control point of the cubic curve segment. And control x2 and control y2 that define the x coordinates of the second control point. Let's look at a diagram now that shows you how the start and end points of a cubic curve interact with its two control points. Suppose you want to draw this curve. First, specify the start x and start y coordinates that you want. Next, the end x and end y coordinates. And then the first and second control points. Once again, remember that this diagram is not necessarily to scale and gives you only a general idea of how these points interact. Okay, Let's show you some JavaFX code now that draws curves. This is the Curve Shapes program, which creates QuadCurves and CubicCurves. Let's compile and run this program and see what it displays. What you see here is a colored QuadCurve on the left and a colored CubicCurve on the right, all on a light green background. Let's show you how these curves are drawn now. First, we create a QuadCurve with a default constructor and then set its properties. We set the coordinates for the starting point, ending point, and single control point. Here, we set the curve's fill color and stroke color. Now, let's look at the CubicCurve. First, we create the CubicCurve with a default constructor. The setter methods define the coordinates for the starting point, first control point, second control point, and ending point. And these setters set the fill color and stroke color. This statement is where we add the two curves to the root scene graph. Now, if you look up the APIs for QuadCurve and CubicCurve, you'll see that both have constructors that set most of the properties you see here. Let me show you. Let's comment out these statements and add this code. This constructor sets the start and end points and the two control points. When we recompile and run, you'll see that the same CubicCurve is drawn. However, I find it difficult to keep track of which property is which when you have this many constructor arguments. That's why I prefer default constructors followed by setters to build the curves and configure them. This is much less error-prone and easier to read. So let's put it back the way it was. Now let's change the control points for these curves and see how it affects the drawing. First, I'll change the x-coordinate of the QuadCurve's control point to 250. When I recompile and run the program, you'll see that the QuadCurve is leaning to the right. And for the CubicCurve, I'll change the x-coordinate of the first control point to 200, and the x-coordinate of the second control point to 500, and this is a larger number. And when I recompile the program and run it, you'll see that the CubicCurve is now stretched and leaning more to the left.